Hello and good evening, everyone. This is Susanne Knabe-Nicol from Police Science Doctor. It's Thursday evening, and sometimes on a Thursday evening, I'm coming to you live to YouTube, Twitter, Facebook, wherever you're watching this, and I'm doing an interview with someone. That someone is either a practitioner of law enforcement or policing, or an ex-practitioner who's got something very interesting to share that I really want people to know about, or it's a subject matter expert. Now, tonight is one of the latter cases. I've got a fantastic person with me today, whom I'm going to introduce in a moment. It's going to be Professor Ray Bull, a very, very, very eminent person on the field of investigative interviewing. So we'll get to that in a minute. The thing I wanted to tell you about first, so that's something I only started setting up today, so it's brand new, is you may know, and you may have been there, I actually had the mental health and policing webinar just about 2 weeks ago now, and it was really, really good. If I do say so myself, it wasn't my content, it was all the people that I had interviewed for the webinar that I was playing the content of. And a lot of people were really interested in that. So what we're going to do next, so Ginny McKenna and I were actually co-hosting the webinar. We're now going to run a series of 3 free workshops. So these are workshops on building stress and resilience in policing. And you're very welcome to attend. They're free. They start on Tuesday, the 8th of June. And I would like you all to come if you're interested at all in improving resilience of yourself. I'm going to post a link here into the chat. So after the interview, please go and have a look. You can register. So as I said, it's free. It's going to be 3 workshops on 3 different days. Register for those. You can attend, you can take part, you can ask questions, and you can get a certificate of attendance, and you can get the replay if you've registered. So all of that will be there. If you can't attend live, you will be sent the link to where you can actually then watch the recording. So it's really going to be worth it. To show you that once again, that's the Stress and Resilience in Policing free workshop series. So starting on Tuesday, the 8th of June. So I really hope to see you there. Now, again, tonight, Professor Ray Bull. He looks a bit like a Texan here, and let's, if you don't know him, then I hope you're going to be surprised by where his accent is from. And if you're watching this live, please, just let us know that you're watching. Where you're watching from is always interesting to see, which countries people are in. And you can also put a question for Ray into the comments. Now, where have you ever had the opportunity to ask Professor Bull a question? If you have a question for him, please put it into the comments. Start it with a Q so that I know it's a question, and then I can ask him when we get to that. Now, without further ado, let me bring on Professor Ray Bull to the stage. Ray, good evening.
Good evening.
Well, thank you for coming here for this interview tonight. Why don't you introduce yourself? Who are you, and why might people know you?
For the last 8 years, I've not been retired from University World, which I had planned to do, but I've been Professor of Criminal Investigation at the University of Derby, which some people might know is in the middle of England, and it's a university which is fast expanding at its professional research activities in criminology, psychology, and social science, law in particular. That's who I am. Why might people know me? Well, I guess the main reason people might know me nowadays is by virtue of them being kind enough to read some of our publications. Just yesterday, I had a very nice email from 2 researchers in the state of Utah in the USA who said, we've read loads of your stuff. They kindly said you have a long list of publications, and if they had looked at that list, they would know that my main area of research is investigative interviewing, but that overlaps, of course, with methods that might help determine whether somebody, for example, a rape complainant, is indeed, as they mainly are, telling the truth. So they say, we know you publish on detecting deception. So when we say we admire your work, we are telling you the truth. That was what the 2 guys from Utah said yesterday. So I think people know me. Well, the people who do know me, of course, there's many people who do not know me, but those who do know me, it's largely through my publications, or they're kind enough as of today to give me the time to try to interest them in what we do.
Well, as I was telling you earlier, I know you from my studies, from my MSc in investigative psychology, and then my PhD. And your name was coming up left, right, and center when I was reading about interviews. I'm really interested in interviews, interrogations, and it was always, Bull, maybe other names, and then a year. And so I feel very honored to have you on today. I know that you're a massive heavyweight internationally on the topic, and it's just great. We have Trudy Gittins watching from West Midlands Police. Hello, good evening.
Hi, Trudy.
She was also at the mental health webinar. Very nice lady. Why and how did you become interested in the topic of investigative interviewing?
My first junior professorship happened to be in London, and that was in the domain of psychology people refer to as cognitive psychology, and in particular, my role was to share what I knew with students about things like memory. And in those early years, I was asked by the Home Office to write a review of what was known about why honest witnesses can sometimes be mistaken when they choose a face or a person from a lineup. And another colleague of mine in our team of cognitive psychologists said, "Oh, that report you wrote is very interesting. Had you thought of using it as part of a book?" I'd never written a book. I was still late 20s, early 30s, something like that. And he was a very good expert on the parts of memory, the pure theoretical parts of memory. I'm more interested in the applications of memory. So we ended up having a book published in 1978 about the strengths and weaknesses of witness memory. So I was working in that area, and then I was fortunate enough to have the pleasure of going to work. I took up my first professorship in Scotland, in Glasgow, and while I was there, I received a phone call from a lawyer saying, "I know you know about witness memory, but do you know anything about interviewing witnesses?" And I said, "Well, this is more than 30 years ago, 20 or 30 years ago." I said, "Well, there's not a lot written yet about the interviewing. There's a lot written about the failures of witness memory." And he said, "Well, I have a particular case where I'm looking for advice about investigative interviewing, as we now call it." He didn't call it that. And it was mainly the phone call of that lawyer that sparked my interest. At that time, we were doing a project in Glasgow courts on young children giving evidence live in court as they used to, but it was more of an eyewitness project. We were looking at what they could remember. We were not necessarily focusing on how well they were talked to by the lawyers, but we included part of that. So it was that project in Glasgow, and particularly the phone call from the lawyer, that got me going in investigative interviewing. Yes.
Mm-hmm. And what would you say are some of the landmarks or milestones of your career?
Well, that's a very embarrassing question, because, of course, to answer it, you end up being arrogant, even if you feel that you're not. So I think that the first book I ever co-authored, the one I've mentioned, and the international publishers of that book were crazy enough just a few years ago to decide to republish it in its initial form. And a number of people were silly enough to buy it, even though it was pretty old, but it was thought the basic arguments were still very, very sound. And then moving on to getting interested in investigative interviewing, in the 80s, I did a lot of work on psychology and police training in general. And I met a number of senior police officers in that. And one in particular, sadly no longer with us, Tom Williamson. The time he was head of the largest murder squad in the world, in the London Metropolitan Police, he felt that police interviewing, which up till 1990-91 had little contribution from psychologists to the fault of psychologists like myself, he felt that the time was right that psychology might be able to make a contribution. And this was at the time when in England and Wales, the Association of Chief Police Officers and the government had jointly realized that the training of police to interview suspects was basically non-existent, and that's why they weren't very good at it, because they hadn't had any training. And so Tom got together a small number of psychologists, I remember, on Sundays to gather together what psychology could offer to the team of detectives who were charged with writing the new training, or the much better training. And that became something called the Peace Method. And I'm constantly and pleasantly surprised when I hear, like every 6 months or a year, that another police force or another country has decided to adopt that method rather than the coercive, aggressive, accusatory method that comes naturally to human beings when they interview suspects, unless they've been well trained. So I think my first book and my involvement since 1990 and still today in this method of interviewing that seems to gather valid information but is within the law and is ethical, and some people refer to it as humane, that's what I think are the main milestones of my career.
Could you maybe, for people who are not familiar with the terminology, explain what PEACE stands for, and just a quick summary of what it actually is?
Yes. So the committee of detectives that were set up by the government and chiefs of police, in those days, 1990, to have 25 years experience as a senior police investigator. Sadly, at that time, most people in those positions were men. So this committee was made up of 12 men, some of whom I knew, and they looked more like career criminals than career criminals do. So the last thing you'd think they'd come up with was with a label for what they developed, which they chose to call it PEACE, P-E-A-C-E, because what they were advocating was not an aggressive, coercive approach, but a respectful, peaceful, almost calm approach to interviewing suspects. And another reason they called it PEACE, to be brief, is the P stands for planning. Your interview will be better the more you plan and prepare. The E stands for make sure you explain to people when you're interviewing as best you can what it's all about, what's going to happen. And then they had another E, which was to engage with the suspect. What we now talk about is to establish rapport with the interviewee. But being traditional English men, they couldn't bring themselves to use a French word, rapport. So they used a confusing word that's hardly ever used in the English language. You know, engage means get before you get married, or it means the toilet is not available. But when you say to engage with somebody, then people say, oh yeah, it's that meaning of the word. So that's what the E stands for. And it says, if you want to get an account, the A, you're more likely to get a comprehensive account if you have explained and if you have engaged. And they talked about various ways of getting the account. And then they say, when you think it's all over, when you think the person has no more to tell you, you do not end the interview. You then have this thing called closure, where basically you summarize and do your best to make sure that the interviewee, who may well have told you things that they find distressing or initially didn't necessarily want to tell you, make sure that before the interview finishes, the interviewee is in a positive frame of mind as possible. So that's the C for closure. And the final letter is another E, which is, in order to get better, you have to evaluate how well you did. And of course, in England and Wales since 1986, the law mandated that interviewing suspects be tape recorded. So you do have a tape recording of what you've done that you can use to evaluate yourself or ask a trusted colleague to give you some feedback. So that's what the PEACE method stands for.
Mm-hmm. And prior to that, can you just give us a quick overview of what interviewing used to be like before the PEACE method was being used?
Well, in this country for decades, the vast majority of interviewing was not bad. There were some famous cases in which courts finally decided, like the appeal court decided, that a person had confessed due to physical or psychological pressure. And we are lucky enough in this country to live in a democracy, and the media have a responsibility to tell citizens about wrongdoing, particularly in government agencies. And so the media always picked up on these high profile cases where there was enormous pressure on the police to track down people and get a confession. And some people may have heard of bombings that occurred, one in Guildford, one in Birmingham, where people were killed. The blame was put on what was called the IRA, the Irish Republican Army. Pressure was put on the suspects, and the courts, I think in their wisdom quite rightly, decided that the confessions these suspects gave, which led them to being in prison, were coerced. They were not voluntary, and they may well not have been, and probably were not genuine. So cases like that were high profile, but the vast majority of interviewing was just inept, very poor. Because of course, when people join an organization such as the police service, they're typically young adults, and they don't have any particular skills. So in the police service, if you were going to become a fast pursuit police car driver, you would have lots of training to do that. If you're one of the few people in this country who was going to be an armed police officer, you would have regular training and evaluation to do that. But until 1992, there was almost no training in interviewing. So people just brought with them their skills from their own life. And luckily, some people without training, I may say so, like yourself, are very good at talking to people to get them to share with you what you want. Most people, particularly men, are pretty inept at it naturally. And so, yeah, to sum up what police interviewing in England was like, it was just very poor, unskilled, haphazard, unplanned. Some studies, once the tape recording began, found that what the interviewers would do is, at the very beginning, after they'd read the person rights and told them, as they must do, why they are suspected, particularly if they've been detained, particularly if they've been arrested, they would then tell them everything they knew about them in the hope they would confess. And when the evidence is very strong, as a guilty suspect or your lawyer will realize it's actually in your interest to own up to it, because if you do that, you'll be better treated in courts. And if you go to prison, you might be better treated by your prison mates if you've manned up to it, so to speak. But that didn't happen in the majority of interviews. So they accused the person said, no, I didn't do it. Then they said, you're a bloody liar or whatever. And then the person didn't, and then the police gave up. So in the majority of interviews with suspects, they just gave up because they didn't know what to do. That's how it was. That's what I mean by being inept.
Mm-hmm. Okay, that does sound very different to hopefully how it is now. Would you say that nowadays officers, so in civilian investigators or police officers, do you think that training is for suspect interviews in particular is good enough, and is it up to date enough with the latest state of research?
I think in England and Wales, it is certainly much better than it was. And in a sense, it's good enough because there don't seem to be any major problems. Like I mentioned earlier about how the media have a duty to inform citizens when improper behavior occurs, for example, by the police. Well, since the peace training was brought in early and mid 1990s, I asked people about this, and they agree with me that I'm not aware of any case in which a person has confessed due to coercive police interviewing. It stopped in its tracks. Bad coercive interviewing. As I said, that didn't happen very often, but it stopped it completely. And then it was realized, two of my good friends and collaborators, Professor Becky Mill and Dr. Andy Griffiths, in their work, they recommended that since not everybody, even with good training, can be good at their job, for example, be a very good interviewer, they recommended, and the police service in England and Wales took on board, that the competence in investigative interviewing be 5 levels. So level 1's the basic training, and if you're quite good at that, you can progress to level 2. You're quite good at that because your interviews are recorded, you can become level 3. Level 3, you have to be level 3 to talk with any children, any person with particular needs, any person who is complaining and therefore likely to be the victim of a sex crime. You have to be level 3 trained to do that. And so as you move up the areas of competence and people become more specialized, they then become pretty good. I'm quite often, by the defense or sometimes prosecution, sometimes by police, sent recordings of interviews. And most of the time, they're pretty good. You know, they're so much better than what they were decades ago. But like any complex task, they're never perfect because it's so difficult to interview either a reluctant victim. You know, a lot of victims of serious crime don't want to go into great detail about it, but you need to know the detail in order to know what the offense is. And just the other day, I was, at the request of the defense, reviewing a videotape recorded interview with a child. And the interviewing itself was almost faultless. But for partly understandable reasons, at the very beginning of the interviewer said to the child, "Okay, tell me what you told your mum." Now, of course, mum is not necessarily a skilled interviewer. And so what the child brings to the police interview is unwittingly, inadvertently, possibly biased or influenced by what conversations the child has had before. So instead of making it clear that the interviewer wanted the child to tell the interviewer from the child's own memory, there are ways of doing that. He just was lazy and said, "Oh, tell me what you told your mum." And that, therefore, to some extent, brings into question the validity of what the child said. I mean, there was nothing in what the child said that indicated any appropriate adult language or concepts which could indicate, you know, inappropriate coaching. So I think it was just an unfortunate error that probably didn't have too much of a negative effect.
It is, so the whole field of interviewing is quite interesting and complex because, so for example, I did my MSc and obviously did some research on investigative interviewing and obviously read a lot of the articles that you had written. Then I became a police investigator. So it was one of my roles in the police force, and I was suspect interview trained. And my role was in the custody investigation unit. So people were arrested, were put in custody. We were in the custody block. We had an office, prepared the interview, did the interview and all of that. And even though I had done the studies and I should have known better, and I'll hold my hands up to that, I also did get my ego involved. You know, it was professionally flattering for me if somebody did confess, even though they were saying something different in the beginning. And I know, and I should have known that that should not have been my objective. The objective is always make the suspect feel safe enough to open up to you.
Yeah.
They will either be innocent and will give you helpful information, or they'll be guilty and give you helpful information. And it's not about you wanting to go in and wanting that sense of achievement. But even I fell into that trap, even though I should have known better. And I thought that was pretty interesting. And and then also another thing, I was also interviewed as a suspect in that police force through an internal investigation. It's all got to do with this website. And I broke some of the rules in terms of, how I'm allowed to publish. So I did nothing dishonest and I did nothing horrible. It was administrative errors, and they investigated me and I was interviewed as a suspect, and that was an interesting experience. So I have the experience of, from the academic side, I have the experience from the investigators side, and I have the experience of the suspect. And, I was realizing that you've asked me that question several times. It is a little bit coercive now. And, I can tell you definitely trying to get me to say something. He was quite pushy, and I did not think he was an experienced interviewer and detective, and became a civilian, and worked for the standards department. But I was not impressed with his interview skills. But as I said, it's easy not to do your best in the job when other things come in. And I thought that was an interesting experience. That I think I was a good interviewer. I was very good at listening. I was very good at building rapport, but and really giving people a voice. And I was very, very well prepared. And I had a reputation of taking ages in my interviews and all of that. But I think that was important, and I stood by that. But there was the one thing where I thought, okay, that I should have done better. It's not about me. It's about this case. It's about this person, and it's about the victim. And whatever I want the outcome to be. And also you need to go into the interview room with an open mind. And I found myself sometimes not doing that, having prepared the interview and having reviewed the evidence. And again, that's a mistake.
Yeah, it's very kind of you to share that with us. And when you, a few minutes ago, asked me, and I hopefully briefly and adequately explained the PEACE method, then the detectives who took psychology and made up the PEACE method, they said that 7 principles underpin how you interview and all of the training at all levels. And one of those principles is to keep an open mind, which is the very most difficult thing for humans to do. The chimpanzees find it easier to be open-minded than humans are. Humans are always striving to confirm what they think. So one of the things when I'm training people around the world, I say that you need to be open-minded because there is research, and I briefly go through it, which shows that a number of people purposely false confess, not through mental illness, which is a very small proportion of false confessions, but in serious crime like human trafficking, organized crime, drugs, a junior member of the organization will falsely confess to what a senior member did to protect the senior member. And while the junior member is in prison, the organization will put £500,000 a year into a bank account and look after his or her family. So you have to be careful about searching for confessions for that reason. Also, if the suspect was involved, their involvement might be more or less serious than you are interviewing them about. And furthermore, in what society quite rightly considered to be very serious crime, like murder or rape, we know that some people are what's called serial rapists or serial murderers. So I say to them, imagine you're interviewing a person that you have good reason to believe has committed at least a sexual assault, if not something more serious like rape. Now, if they confess, you should be suspicious as to, now, why are they confessing? Is it that they have committed 6 other rapes and they know that we don't know about them? So if they readily confess to this one, we won't even look into what else they may have done in this country or abroad. So there are several good reasons to be open-minded that are to do with being a good investigator and not just being driven by data in other countries where they still employ coercive interviewing. And there are a number of innocence projects around the world which look at people who have been in prison that it's later like almost proven that they were innocent and they're released, and they look into what might have caused their conviction. And a substantial proportion of those false convictions involved a coerced confession. So to say to people to be open-minded, they say, okay, but that's difficult. But when you give them positive reasons to be open-minded, like I just tried to do, they then say, oh, yeah, so he may have done more than we think he did. We need to be open-minded. I say, yes.
See, that they did not mention in training school.
No.
And that's a good point. What was your most difficult work project thing or case that you had worked on?
The most difficult project was I've been blessed with working with a number of extremely able people whilst doing their PhD. And several of those PhDs have benefited enormously from cooperation by agencies such as the police, who have given us access to recordings of real life interviews. And this is very difficult to get access to. And in most countries in the world, if they record, researchers can't get access. So we now and again get access. One particular PhD student who was going to focus, and indeed she did at the end, on interviews with suspected murderers and rapists. And these interviews, with appropriate breaks, because there's laws about that, were relatively long, like on average 5 or 6 hours of interviewing. So very complicated interviews. And with a large police force, she took the lead. So she negotiated access with the senior officer, got it all in writing. And then when she went back 2 months later, that rising star, open-minded guy had been promoted, and his replacement said, no, I'm not giving you access. And she said, well, I have it in writing from this office, from the office of, who signed it was just the guy in the office at the time, but it's signed by this office. And he said, I don't care, you're not getting access. So then, and she's now more than halfway through her limited time to do her PhD, that proved very difficult for me and particularly for her. But luckily, through other connections with other forces, we ended up getting a decent sample. I think it was 56 interviews that she then managed to analyze, and finished writing her PhD the day before she had to submit it. So that was very stressful for her, and vicariously, yeah, that was not a good time.
No, and I think many people who work in the police, they don't realize the value of sharing information. And I don't even have to ask you. I'm sure that the information would have been anonymous, redacted. There wouldn't have been any personal details, and there's no good reason for police not to share it. It's just in the culture. And there's I actually did a video on that. It was police versus academia or something, where academia lives on the fact that if you find something that is of value, you need to share it, and other people need to scrutinize it before it's published, and only then is it real knowledge. Whereas in policing, you find something great and you basically keep it to yourself. They're thinking, well, why should I share it? They're very suspicious of sharing information, and that is unfortunately very counterproductive. And that's one of the challenges of academia and policing working together. So I'm glad that she got it finished. I feel for her that was a very stressful time, and it's a shame. I don't think it was necessary. It didn't benefit anyone for this new person to then say, no, I'm not doing that. Tell us how you're involved in improving professional skills, so the skills of professional interviewers.
Well, by doing things like today. So thank you for inviting me. By trying to conduct research that's as realistic as possible. So therefore, when people in a relevant organization, such as the police or any other investigative agency, if they hear about it, I'll talk about how they might hear about it in a minute, they say, yeah, that sounds like the kind of thing we or I do. So I'm no longer particularly interested in running studies on the university campus involving undergraduates, because police say, what's that got to do with us? So it's, as we just discussed, getting access and doing real life, or what we call in jargon, ecologically valid research, is much, much more difficult and very time consuming, and sometimes, as we just said, can be very dispiriting. So if you can do very meaningful research that then you publicize in a way that the relevant professionals might have time and access to, as well as from a professorial career point of view, publishing that research in what we call internationally high-grade research journals where you talk about all the research and how you did it and the complex analyses. But when you describe that same study in a professional outlet, they're not interested in those kind of things, and you're able more to talk about the real life arena, talk about some possible suggestions that come out of it, some possible policy implications. So that's what we try to do. But I think the major way I seek to achieve what you've asked me is to be lucky enough to be invited to go to talk about it in various places around the world nowadays. I mean, the COVID lockdown has been a great time for me because I've not had jet lag for over a year. And normally I'm away 2 weeks out of 4 somewhere, often quite long haul, and my sleeping pattern normally is rubbish. So of course one wouldn't be invited if people didn't know and think relatively well about what you've got to say. So you have to have outlets such as today, in which people can make their own decision as to whether they think you've got anything worthwhile to contribute.
And having spoken and taught and researched globally, what are your main observations about the differences or commonalities in investigative interviewing? Well,
when the peace method was developed, and I have to say this, so the officers developing it, when they drafted everything, to my complete amazement, I didn't know this was going to happen. A big parcel arrived at my university office from them, saying, in here you will find what we think are final drafts of everything, lots of booklets, training manuals. And they said, and of course we've had to write it in everyday street language, no long words, no abstract concepts. But we've chosen to include a lot of psychology that you and the other psychologists sent to us or told us about. So Ray, can you please check, and I'm now quoting from them, whether we've got all this psychology correct? And it was amazing, you know, it was brilliant. That was a really crucial thing. What was your question? I'm rambling again. Remind me of the question.
It was about the global commonalities, yes, or differences, right, across interviewing.
Right. So then, when the peace training first started, it went to most experienced detectives, and I was commissioned by the government to assess the interviewing of these newly trained people to see to what extent it matched up with the aims of the training, and by and large it did. And we started publishing on the effectiveness of the peace method within England and Wales, where it started. But I always had a worry that because I was, and I'm better now, but at that time, mid-1990s, I was pretty ignorant of other cultures around the world. You know, I had a surface understanding, I thought, but I didn't have a deep understanding of various cultures. And so I became, worry might be too strong a word, I became concerned that when other countries expressed an interest in adopting the peace method, I was concerned as to whether it would transfer its major principles, such as rapport, use of open questions rather than closed questions, whether this would generalize to other cultures and other forms of language. And to my complete surprise, there are now 20, 30, 40 publications from other countries on whether that kind of investigative interviewing is effective. And it seems to be. I mean, there was a very interesting study, not by myself, that asked very experienced investigators around the Pacific Rim about whose job it was to talk with terrorist suspects. Just asked their impressions of what kind of interviewing over their decades of experience they had found to be most effective. And these people had never heard of the peace method. They have now, but way back they hadn't. And when you read what they said, you think, oh my God, that's the peace method. Mm-hmm. So they had picked up and found to be effective in their own culture the basic principles that had started off here in the UK. So I only know of one study where a key aspect of the peace method was ineffective. It caused confusion, and these were young men from a culture in which the police are highly coercive. And these young men had moved with their families to a country in Europe where the police interviewing is more like the peace method. And the researcher, who to her credit was given access to the recordings of these interviews, so this is real life stuff, she quite right, I had the pleasure of examining her PhD, that's why I remember it so well. And what she found was that the people from the more coercive culture were confused by the police being respectful, humane, taking their time, not being coercive. They didn't know what the hell was going on, the suspect. So that's the only study I know where it was almost counterproductive to be respectful, because it just confused the suspects.
That's quite interesting. What would you say are the, almost in a bullet point format, what are the ingredients for a very good investigative interview?
To plan it properly, that's perhaps the most important thing of all. And that's the thing that most people don't do, or their organization doesn't give them time to do, because they don't realize how important it is, particularly in serious cases. I mean, if you're a fraud investigator in most countries, you do get time to prepare. But for cases even more serious and more important than fraud, you don't get the time. So it's getting the organization and individuals to plan and prepare properly, and to gather all the information from other sources, from other human beings, witnesses. And if you're in a country which is wealthy enough to have forensics or CCTV, or where people use credit cards, gather as much information as you can. So what I say when I travel around the world is, historically in my country, and in many countries, I don't say in your country because I don't know, I say in a serious investigation, what people used to do, the first thing they would do was interview the suspect. I said, no, you don't do that. Sometimes you need to do that, but that's not the default position. The default position is the last thing you do is interview the suspect, because you have to plan and prepare and gather all the relevant information. So that's really important. And then, even though research shows that a proportion of suspects, about a third, guilty suspects, have already decided to give an account if they're treated appropriately, let's say the majority plan to deny, or as yet undecided when you start interviewing them. So you have to assume that the majority of suspects are not immediately going to tell you everything, though some will. So you have to engage with them. You have to have rapport with them. And certainly when I was asked by the government to write the official guidance, that first ever in the world, on how to interview child witnesses, way back in '92, in that document, it actually says no interview should proceed without rapport having been established. So planning and preparation, rapport, and then the third thing is, and this is really difficult to do, that most of the questions you put to the interviewee, whether witness, victim, or suspect, be what we call open questions. They're not suggestive. They allow the person to answer from their own memory. And why it's so difficult to do is that most conversations, particularly men talking to men, women are better than men, but far from perfect. Not every woman is good at open questions. So a woman would say, Ray, how was your day? Right? Open question, no suggestion, other than I wasn't sleeping all day. But whereas a man would say, did you enjoy watching the football? That's a closed question. It's not necessarily that suggestive. I'm just using an example. So asking open questions is really important, but it's very, very difficult. the PhD I mentioned earlier, where we eventually got access to 56 long interviews with suspects. Some of those interviewers were just brilliant, that even after 4 hours, they were still phrasing a question in an open way. And what we found was that style of questioning kept the suspects on topic, because a lot of guilty suspects will talk about something, but not what the investigator wants them to talk about. So keeping the suspect on relevant topics is actually difficult. And asking open questions was associated with greater success at keeping the suspects on topic. Where you think that closed questions would be more successful? No. Yeah, so asking open questions, which you have been doing to me, is difficult.
I've done in my life, I've done quite a lot of different kinds of interviews. So when I was doing my undergraduate in psychology, I was working part-time, I think during that time and afterwards, in market research a lot. So in call centers in London, but calling people in Germany or Austria or Switzerland in German, because we got more money for that than if we, than calling within England. And there was a script, and it was very, and so I sort of developed skills in convincing people to take part, even though they weren't very interested, obviously, initially. Nobody wants to take part initially, but, so that's one way of interviewing. Then obviously investigative interviewing, very different, one question at a time, open, non-leading and all that. And then I noticed at some point when somebody on the radio interviews someone, they put several questions into one, and I do that. So, for example, when I asked, I'm going to ask you later, but, what is this and what do you think of it? And I think because in an interview situation like this, you want to have the person, giving valuable, interesting information in a condensed space of time, whereas with investigative interviews, it's very different. So there's nuances to how you do that. That is quite interesting, and obviously you need to do it the right way in the right in the right occasion. What would you say are the ingredients for a horrible suspect interview then?
Well, the most horrible, of course, which still exists in a number of countries, is torture. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture, you can only do that job for 5 years, it's so stressful. In his final report in 2016, a law professor, Professor Juan Mendez, recommended that the UN draft guidance on interviewing suspects that avoided torture, coercion, or inhumane treatment. And why he recommended that is because he found out that in a vast number of countries, including those that had signed up to the United Nations Anti-Torture Charter, that government agencies in those countries were still torturing people, or it's very difficult for me to speak about this because I know a bit about it, or treating people in a very inhumane way, such that they end up giving you anything to stop the inhumane treatment, but what they often give you is rubbish, or if they've been trained, they purposely give you false information that takes you down the wrong path. So that's by far the worst kind. And I'm sorry to repeat myself. I mean, sadly, it goes on as we speak. That's the worst kind.
And you were involved in drafting that document for the UN, weren't you? Can you? And it's been published recently.
Yes. What's happened is so Professor Mendez's recommendation was adopted by the UN that there be such a document, and of course, then we spent 3 years writing the document, which, as you say, has only last week become publicly available. And now, of course, activity is taking place to hope that the majority of countries will support down the road, maybe this year, next year, a motion to go forward to the UN, which will be approved, that this become an approved United Nations document. There are other famous documents, the rights of the child, the Nelson Mandela rules about how people should be treated in prison, and so on. And Professor Mendez is a very kind man, And so the official title of the document is Principles of Effective Interviewing. But we call it the Mendez Principles, after him. Mm-hmm. Yes, and that's now publicly available. There is a website where people can access it.
And I'm leading you now, talking about still not perfect interviews, or something that has the reputation of not being perfect interviews. Can you briefly explain what the READ technique is, REID,
yes,
and what it entails and what you think about it?
Yes. Well, it's named after its founder, a man in the United States called John Reed, who in the 1950s, so I understand, was asked by some fellow investigators about how to get guilty people to confess. So he started writing about that, and then others joined the organization, and they've published several broad and deep books, and they've trained hundreds of thousands of people, not only in the USA, around the world. And at the time they developed their model, they thought that two components would be useful. The first component is when you're interviewing somebody, particularly a suspect, you use their behavior to determine whether you think they're lying or not. And if you decide that the suspect is lying, you then move into a psychologically, not physical, psychologically coercive procedure or unethical procedure, like minimizing what they've done. Say, oh, I guess you raped her because she was asking for it. Look at the clothing she had on, no wonder. And, that's horrendous minimization. And then at last, psychological research came on the scene, decades after their first publications, which found, first of all, and there's loads of research on this, that you can't tell if a person is lying from their behavior. And so therefore, all that training, that if the person does this, they're lying, therefore you need to be coercive, was based on the false premise about you can tell whether somebody's lying from their behavior. And the second part is that some of the aspects of the original READ technique were found out by research and indeed by common sense to be counterproductive. Like when the person that you've now decided has lied, which could be a mistake, you cut off their denials, you interrupt them, you accuse them of being a liar, you stand very close to them, you raise your voice to them. And research in the last 20 years has shown, if anything, it's counterproductive. That causes guilty people to have what we call psychological reactions and say, well, I was thinking of telling you, but if you treat me like that, I'm not going to. And now the READ organization, certainly in Canada, is marketing what they call the READ Peace approach, which is a kind of combination of both methods, which I'm not sure is a good idea. But some other organizations that evolve with the READ technique, another big organization named after its founders, Wicklander Zulaski, they had a franchise to train the READ technique, and about 10 years ago, they started speaking to relevant psychologists, Professor Saul Kassin in the States, I think, certainly myself, about what they were training. And the co-founder, Dave Zulaski, had a number of conversations with him, and he asked me to go to some of their workshops and go through their big book and to tell him which parts of their training and workshop were backed up by research, and some were, which parts on which there is yet no training, research rather, and which parts of their training were countered by the findings of modern research. Mm-hmm. And in the light of the feedback they got from a variety of people, including myself, they ditched all the coercive stuff. So they went public and said, we're no longer going to train the READ technique. They have some things in it that probably wouldn't be acceptable in some countries, what's called theme development. Again, maybe you stole that money. Could it be that one of your children in the USA needs medical treatment? They're just making up this as a possible excuse for the person. They have no evidence that this man needed the money because the child needed medical treatment. So they just chuck out a load of themes in the hope that the person might feel like telling the truth if they understand him. I mean, in the peace method, in the planning and preparation, if you're sure of something, you can then mention it to the suspect, but you don't just make up these kind of themes, or the horrible theme like she deserved it, look at the way she was dressed. You know, that's horrendous and completely unethical. But Zulaski has much more up to date with the relevant research than they ever were before.
And what do you think of, so I was speaking to someone who's, you know, a very enlightened police psychologist, and they were saying that absolutely all the coercive aspects of the reach technique, you know, that used to be the case, you know, that's gone now. But they were saying that what they think does work well is what we're not allowed to do here in the UK is to use deception. So not saying, well, we have forensic evidence linking you to this, but, you know, what if we found your DNA on there? You know, how would you explain this? And that is something we can't do in the UK. But they feel that it's sort of leveling the playing field, because the suspect can deceive, and then it gives, you know, greater, well, not power or freedom, but it gives more tools to the interviewer to be able to make these insinuations. What do you think about that?
Yeah. I often, in most of my you know, workshops that are more than a day or two when there's sufficient time, I go into that in quite depth, and I say to the audience, okay, so you're interviewing a suspect in a serious case, because if it was not that serious, maybe you wouldn't make the effort to lie to them about something. So as you say, that's a good example. What if we found your DNA, etc.? So immediately the guilty suspect hears that, they know, they don't have my DNA, because if they had it, they would have said. And so apart from lying to suspects being completely unethical, and is certainly very strongly worded against it in the document that's going to go forward to the United Nations that we talked about earlier, it can actually be highly counterproductive if the person is guilty, because of course a guilty suspect is the best witness to what happened, unless they're completely out of their mind on drugs or alcohol, which is relatively rare. So the guilty suspect knows what he or she did. So if you say, what if we found your fingerprint? And the suspect knows they always wore gloves. They start laughing internally and say, oh, I'm getting out of here because they haven't got anything on me. So it's not only unethical, it's actually stupid to lie to suspects, well, guilty ones. It might create false confessions from innocent ones on whom it puts a lot of pressure. And of course, if the person is particularly vulnerable, you know, a young person or a person with limited cognitive ability, they might end up confessing because the evidence seems overwhelming and they don't think clearly like you or I do. And so, yeah, there's no real benefit of lying. I mean, in this country, if a crime occurred in Main Street, in the high street of a certain city here in England, where everybody knows there would be likely to be some CCTV cameras, then for a police officer to say, well, this crime occurred in Main Street, and we're going to go to the recordings of the public cameras and security cameras that the pub or the bank might have. That's true. There are those cameras, and they are going to go and look at them. So that's not lying. So there's not a gray area between lying and not lying, but the language can end up being a bit similar. Yeah, but it's really stupid to lie to suspects, particularly in serious cases.
And I guess it depends on what you're trying to get out of the interview, because I would say coercive tactics, just like when Catholics were torturing women, in the Middle Ages, are very effective at getting confessions. But then, what is the quality of that confessions?
Exactly.
How many of these women who were burnt as witches, who confessed to being a witch, were actually a witch? I would love to see proof that even one of them was a witch, and that proof would make history, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, so it depends on what the outcome is. And, like I said earlier, if you want the suspect to work with you, because if they're guilty, you want them to be able to tell you, to feel safe enough to tell you that. If they're innocent, and you said as well that they're your best witness. So, whatever it is, you want them to tell you.
Well, a further thing that I've been thinking about and haven't yet written about, but so other people have written about this thing. It relates to the concept of procedural justice. And a lot of people have written that if people are treated well in prison, they may be less likely to commit the crime again when they come out. So I'm interested, and I'm not the only one, in the notion that if the current modern method of interviewing, which is called investigative interviewing, based on the peace method, which happens to be a way in which you remember that the person you're interviewing, whatever bad thing they may well have done, they're nevertheless a human being. And in most countries, they're not going to be executed for what they've done. They're going to go to prison and they're going to come out. So how do you reduce the likelihood of when they come out, they're not doing it again? And how do you reduce the likelihood of then not being badly behaved in a good prison? It's called, some American writers call it the spillover effect, like spilling over from prison to back into society. And I'm interested in, could that concept also apply from the interview to the prison to then coming back to society?
Okay, that's interesting. That's not something that I've come across yet. So I'll be interested to see what you find, or what people find.
If there's anybody listening, please don't steal that idea, because I haven't written about it yet.
Okay, it's being copyrighted by Professor Rabel just now. If you had a magic wand and you could wave it to make one change in policing, what would that be?
I think it's something we've all gone back to, which I said is really difficult, and that is to try to remain open-minded. An example of this could be that many people around the world, including some professionals in some countries, and I'm not just referring to the police, but to lawyers and the media, are of the opinion that the proportion of people, whether they be male or female, who make a complaint about rape, that they feel that there is a substantial proportion of those people who are mistaken. It's a wrong or false complaint. Now, I had the pleasure of training in Jamaica with one of the UK's most experienced police officers. And we were doing a 3-day workshop for investigators in Jamaica who investigated allegations of sexual misconduct, sexual abuse. And I remember this. And he began by introducing himself and said that in his career, he had been involved, but not the head of, about 200 investigations concerning a complaint of being raped. And in 300, he was the senior investigating officer. He's now been serving for 30 years as a rising star police officer. And then he said, in these 500, how many do you think we came to the view were valid? He said, write down your answer, don't shout it out. So they wrote down what they thought. And then he said, well, I can only speak for my country, England. He said, in those 500 cases, we were sure that 2 were purposely false and 2 were probably like errors of memory, that the person may not necessarily have been purposely lying, but they got it wrong. So what he's saying is, in 496, the police came to the view, at least in his investigation, that the account was credible. Whether it was credible enough to lead to a prosecution and conviction is for the prosecution, the courts to decide, not the police. So I know there's a lot of literature around the world that's very dispiriting about the progress that rape cases make, but he was a very unusual and gifted police officer, and I knew from examining PhDs and other things that had looked at real life data around the world on the validity of complaints about serious sexual crime, and the percentage is in various countries that have been studied is very low, but that's not what most people think.
Mm-hmm.
So to be open-minded, that what may or may not have happened, or what this person is telling me may or may not be accurate, and to have a kind of open-minded, wide view, and not to jump to conclusions. And almost nobody, if there's anybody listening, will know who my hero is. I have a hero who is a fictional American detective from some decades ago, and on a variety of TV channels around the world, you can still see his 1 or 2 hour, he did many episodes and made some full-length movies. And it's called Detective Columbo.
I watched that as a child.
And if you watch Columbo, it's fiction. Whoever wrote it was brilliant. It was before the peace method. He doesn't jump to any conclusions. He seeks alternative hypotheses. If this were to happen, if it happened this way, what evidence would I need? But then it could have happened that way. So what evidence do I need, or what evidence do I have? And he's the best example available in the public domain of how to do it properly.
I remember his glass eye and a cigar and a beige trench coat.
Yeah, so if we have a few more minutes. So I say to people, and it's surprising in how many countries, including China, where quite a few of the detectives in the audience in China have seen Columbo. And I say to those who've seen him, so I say, when he's going about his professional work, what kind of clothing does he wear? And they say, oh, he looks terrible. And I say, yeah, he wears clothing that tea shops reject. He is so disheveled, but his clothes look old. They've got stains on them. He's got egg stain down the tie. And then I say, what do you remember about the car that he drives to his investigations? And then it's always going wrong. It backfires, makes lots of noise. It's worth about $50 US. So I say, why does quite a senior detective who's been a police officer for a long while, Lieutenant Columbo, who obviously would get a pretty good salary, why does he choose clothing when he interviews and arrives in a car that makes him look the opposite of professional? And they kind of look, and then this is towards the end of my workshop, so most of them then get it, that that helps him not be coercive. That lulls the guilty person into a false sense of security that they're talking to an idiot. So they'll say more. They won't be so guarded in what they say as if he turned up very smart in an expensive car. They will be very guarded. So he gives a false impression on purpose of being incompetent. So I've been trying to give that false impression today of incompetence.
You did not succeed.
Oh dear.
If people only took away one thing from the talk that we had today, what would you want that one thing to be?
I would want them to feel positive that, particularly if they're in the setting of a country where as yet there is not, unlike in England now, a good relationship between investigators and police and other investigators on the one hand and researchers on the other. You know, in most countries in the world, there is still a great chasm or gulf between the world of university and the world of investigating policing, as it was in this country decades ago. I would want each of those sides and anybody who could help to say, you need to talk to each other. You can learn from each other. And you can do what people who become investigators, people who become police. Why does somebody choose the really difficult job of a police officer in many countries where they're often very poorly paid? The majority of people, and there is research on this, the majority of people who become police officers, they don't join so they can beat up and kill people. They join because they want to improve their own society. They join because they want to do good by people. And that open-mindedness of wanting to improve society is what researchers want to do. You have the same goal. Don't be frightened of each other. You know, you're both working to help make things better. So that's what I would like people to take away.
Okay. Excellent. Professor Raybould, thank you very much for your time this evening.
Thank you for your very good questions.
Thank you for watching. I hope you found this content useful. You can get access to each episode's transcript with key learning points, timestamps, and references if you get yourself onto my mailing list. Just go to the main website on policesciencedoctor.com, and on the bottom of each page you will find a sign-up form for notifications of new content. Just enter your first name, your preferred email address, and the type of organization you work for. You will not get any spam. This is just for me to let you know about new content and for you to get access to all the transcripts.